You're listening to Community Focus from KEDT. I'm Spencer Cihak. Excited to have KRIS specialty producer Rachel Denny Clow joining me on the pod. Her reporting on the Corpus Christi Housing Authority has caused a ripple effect throughout the city. The latest 6 Investigates report found that the CCHA may have violated the Texas Open Meetings Act. Last week, the City Council called the $350 million worth of deals to acquire high-end apartment complexes apparently illegal. Here is what Corpus Christi Housing Authority CEO Gary Alsup had to say at the City Council meeting.
I'm also a little unclear of why this has been determined to be illegal. State statutes are very clear, indicating that it is a legal action by the Housing Authority. And in fact, I've passed around today an article about our sister housing authority in Plano, who has been through a similar, not exact, but a very similar process. Recently, a judge has made a determination that neither the state nor the school district have standing to challenge the constitutionality of the statutes under which the housing authority acquired those properties.
Before we start, it was great getting to chat with Rachel last Thursday. There are a lot of different elements to this story. Our conversation focuses on just one part of it. You could read more at KRISTV.com. The Housing Authority is an independent public agency, meaning the Corpus Christi City Council does not have a direct say over their operations. However, the mayor does select the board. Housing authorities receive their funding from the federal government and provide assistance for housing in a variety of ways for people making significantly less than the median income of the community. With that, it's time to lock in. Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time here to chat about this.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about what's going on at the Housing Authority.
It certainly is a story with a lot of different layers. Let's kind of start with the beginning. This initial investment of these 13 properties 5 months ago. What's kind of the decision process really behind those types of moves, and how did it get to the point where we are today?
We are still unraveling a lot of that. I will say that our investigation began when a source reached out to me with a spreadsheet and said, what is going on? Why do we have all of these high-end apartment complexes potentially being removed from our tax rolls? So that happened about 2 months ago, which is when I started digging in. At the end of the day, what I've been able to kind of glean is that it seems as though the Housing Authority is forward-looking toward what's happening federally, right? So potential cuts to HUD vouchers, other potential funding cuts. And this opportunity that was presented to the Housing Authority by a consultant really seemed to be a way to kind of improve their overall financial health, right? And we can kind of break down how that happens. But at the end of the day, this is about money. This is not about increasing affordability for working class families in this community.
How does that then translate to purchasing more luxury type apartments? Why is that the route that they wanted to go?
If I go back to the first interview that I did with the CEO of the Housing Authority, I got the impression, and that entire interview was posted to YouTube on Chris 6 News's YouTube page because I wanted people to see the entire interview. The sense that I get from Gary in some of his own words is, I don't know what to do. I've got all these people on a Section 8 waiting list. I know I'm not going to get additional vouchers. I don't know what to do. This is something that I can do. So then the question becomes, well, is the return on investment worth the loss of properties from our tax rolls? And how do you balance that? And are you actually accomplishing what you set out to do here? Workforce housing is not necessarily a bad idea. It's about how it's implemented.
So how is it implemented right now versus what would a positive version of that look like?
Well, I'm going to tell you primary concerns, and I've spoken with people statewide who have reached out to say this is not a good deal. Experts statewide have called to explain how it should work and how it isn't working. I've looked at, and this is a story, so you're getting a little sneak peek at a story that will be airing soon, we've looked at the closing statements. So for each of these properties, we looked at the closing statements to see what kind of fees were assessed, who was paid to put these deals together. And that's illuminating, right? So in a typical workforce housing deal where you're going to essentially give a private entity the ability to not pay taxes, you want to keep all the costs low. We have the company that put these deals together for 13 properties. How much do you think they made on these deals?
Right now, that 350, I'm going to guess $40 million.
No.
Okay.
Okay,
Oh,
so we're
gotcha,
going to go back.
gotcha.
So
Okay.
if I'm a consultant
Oh,
and
yes.
my job
Mhm.
is to put together a deal, right? I'm bringing the apartment complex to the table and I'm bringing the housing authority to the table.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars at the very least.
So for 13 properties, a single consultant was paid for $4.3 million.
Wow.
Right? So already there, you're reducing affordability because that's coming off the bottom line of what these businesses are able, right? I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. Okay. So, for instance, we obtained through a confidential source, I'm going to pull out this document so that I can kind of explain it. Ascenda Capital, which is a company based in California, I will say this is not the company that received the $4.3 million. I'm going to kind of keep that on the down low until we publish that story. So Ascenda Capital created a document that was essentially a proposal sheet to investors to say, hey, participate in these workforce housing deals. Specifically, this document's for the Azure in Corpus Christi. If you do that, you're going to have in the first year a return on investment of $400,000 because you're not going to pay taxes on $564,000. You're only going to pay $92,000 to the housing authority, and your actual rental loss is roughly $63,000. So ultimately, this company is benefiting by not paying taxes. And the idea of workforce housing is you don't pay taxes, so you're paying a fee to the housing authority and you're reducing rent. What this document actually shows is they increased rent for people participating in the program. So if I'm at 80% AMI and I qualify for this program, this proposal says I would pay more rent than the rent they're already charging.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you look at from an investor standpoint, over 10 years, they would have a return on investment participating in this program, an increase of $11.4 million. That's the private company.
Pretty good deal for them.
It's a great deal.
Yeah.
It's a great deal. The housing authority, in these closing documents, they brought in $1.6 million in ground lease fees. So again, who is truly benefiting? Housing authority has not yet publicly stated how they would be using that money, but certainly they are looking forward to, as we lose funding from the federal government, how can we increase the money we're bringing in? It's been described as the housing authority is selling our tax base at pennies on the dollar. They're getting 15% of every dollar brought back to them. I don't know, and I have to be careful not to share opinions, but it's just not adding up.
Absolutely. And right now, those 13 apartments, it's $7.5 million a year in total that the city would be missing out on.
Not the city. So specifically, if you look at those properties, it would be $7.5 million in unpaid tax to all of the taxing entities.
Okay.
The concern was when we kind of discovered what was going on and began publishing stories, the housing authority was in process of entering into several more contracts. So they had closing documents that were in process that would have then increased it significantly for the city, Del Mar College, CCISD, all of our taxing entities.
And these deals not only affect the people that are trying to find housing, that are going through hard times, it's also hurting other entities as well, like the schools.
Correct. One of the interesting things that Mr. Alsop said during our first interview is he said these workforce housing projects are for those in the middle, right? So for teachers and firefighters and police officers, What we haven't talked about is we haven't talked about whether those individuals would even qualify for a workforce housing property at 80% AMI, right?
Mhm.
Because if you actually look at what 80% AMI is, most would not even qualify. They make too much. And then let's factor in the loss of tax dollars. So how do you make that up? Do you raise taxes? Do you reduce what you're spending? Do you do a combination of both? What services have to go away to make up the loss of these tax dollars? I think that many public officials took issue with Mr. Alsop, the CEO of the Housing Authority, calling this a rounding error. He basically said, at the end of the day, this is a very small percentage of these governmental entities' overall budgets. We're not taking that much. It's a rounding error. I'll tell you, that rounding error equates to services and people. And the public officials that I've spoken to wouldn't have had a problem with this if it was actually living up to the promise. And that's really where the question is.
How did we get here? How have these deals been able to take place? And up until very recently, until this report came out, really, that changes are starting to be made.
I will say that I think this was caught fairly quickly. The Housing Authority was never on my radar. It was not on my radar until a source reached out and said, you need to look at what's going on. I will say that at KRISTV, our investigative team consists of myself and one investigative reporter. We have other reporters that do investigative reporting, but when you look at the lack of resources in a community, when you don't have, Caller Times has some investigative reporting work as well, but they also don't have the resources that they used to have. And so we cover 12 counties. There are not enough watchdogs to go around. There are not enough people keeping an eye on what's happening with governmental entities. It never in a million years occurred to me I needed to start looking at agendas for the Housing Authority. It just didn't, because I focus on the city, I focus on the school district, I focus on little towns that really need a lot of help. This one came out of nowhere, and it's because we don't have watchdogs.
We haven't talked about the agenda process that you had just mentioned, and that being another layer of this. That would constitute a crime if they had covered up as what it looks like on the agendas right now.
I'm not going to comment as to whether it would be a crime. I will say that, as I mentioned to you earlier, there are layers and layers and layers to this, and I think as we unravel one piece, we find more. I will say that I have made a career of being educated in the Open Meetings Act and the Public Information Act. Their agendas do not properly notify the public of what is to be discussed. Their executive session items are not noticed properly. They have gone into executive session. I've reviewed every single recording from this year. Every time they have gone into executive session without legal justification. I stood up at the last board meeting and objected to the illegal executive session, and they did it anyway. At the end of the day, their agendas have almost no information. Their website has very little information. And if I'm looking at an agenda, and I'm pretty educated when I'm reading agendas, I know what red flags there are. All it says is enter into MOU with blank apartment complex. Why would I in a million years think that the Housing Authority is entering into land lease fees and gifting, essentially gifting, it is allowed in the government code, but tax exempt status to $350 million worth of properties in Corpus Christi? I wouldn't have gotten that from the agenda.
What's kind of the next steps from here?
Well, I think that clearly the CEO believes in these projects. He believes in the efficacy of them. I will say that the newly appointed board members, so there were 3 new board members appointed last month by the mayor. And to be clear, I think there's a lot of confusion because the Housing Authority is not part of the city of Corpus Christi, right? And at the end of the day, the mayor appoints the board, and that's really where the city's involvement ends. I will say that those board members at the last meeting put a pause to ending any pending transactions. So that was roughly 233 million more properties that could be pulled off the tax rolls. They also, and it gets super complicated, they also tabled an item that would have essentially transferred properties from Cameron County Housing Finance Corporation. It's another 200 million into the Housing Authority. So they put a stop to about $433 million in additional property. And we can get into the minutia. I don't know that your listeners want to hear that. Friday, there's an additional board meeting. There are a lot of interesting items on that board meeting. There is a review of the CEO's contract, the compensation study that resulted in an increase in his pay. And there is also a request for outside legal counsel. Specifically, they're looking at counsel that can help them kind of evaluate these deals, look at how do we begin to unravel them. They're looking at outside counsel who actually understands the Open Meetings Act, which is important. There is an item that is discussing unwinding these deals. You know, at the end of the day, journalists can present the facts, but the people in positions of power are the ones who will have to unravel these deals, or not, right? They may choose to not do that. The city of Corpus Christi, Del Mar College, Nueces County, they're all pursuing and looking into what kind of legal remedy they may have, which may be as simple as getting a judge to declare that they were invalid because they violated the Open Meetings Act.
Rachel, I think we're going to leave it at that. That was very well said. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you once again to Rachel for taking the time to come in and chat. On Friday, more deals similar to the ones we discussed were canceled by the board. It was also decided that outside legal help will be brought in to decide whether already approved tax exemptions can be rescinded. Thank you for listening to Community Focus from KEDT. Follow us on our socials at your KEDT. If you enjoyed, please leave a review and check out our other pods, A Day in the Life and South Texas Midday.